approximately 100,000 employees enlisted into the armed forces during the First World War, and of that roughly 20,000 were killed.
The First World War was the first real sort of industrialised, mechanised, mass industrial conflict, and as part of that it was the first major conflict that really utilised the full kind of range of possibilities of the railways. Most of the main railway stations in London were hugely symbolic as a kind of a location of parting for soldiers and their loved ones.
The most significant stations were Waterloo for transit through Southampton docks and Victoria for Folkestone and Dover.
For many people, they were the final frontier for the war. That was where you went to wave off your loved ones, and it was where you saw them come home.
Women were absolutely vital to the functioning of the railways during the First World War. Actually, before the war started, there was a female contingent as part of the workforce of the railways. There were about 13,000 women, but that expanded massively.
That opened up a number of new roles for them in different areas that they hadn't really worked in before, such as manning stations, ticket offices, ticket collections, and in some cases becoming guards. Another role that they took was engine cleaning, which sounds very mundane, but it is in fact a very important role. Without them taking on the roles that were left vacant by those that had enlisted, the railways wouldn't have been able to provide the continuity of service and the flexibility of service that they did.
Around 1912 they started designing the ambulance trains in secret, which meant that the first ambulance trains were rolling into Southampton ready for action 18 days after the outbreak of war. Ambulance trains made the journey home a lot quicker. There was an account of men who were injured first thing in the morning in France one morning, being back at Charing Cross by 2:15 in the afternoon. On one of those huge trains, the grunt work was done by orderlies who were quite often untrained, very young, and they would be doing things like changing dressings, cleaning out the train, serving the dinners. The vast majority of people who travelled on ambulance trains, particularly in the UK, would have survived the journey because you weren't put on board if there was thought to be any risk. There were rudimentary operating facilities on board so that staff could do emergency procedures to stem the flow of bleeding before passengers were taken to a proper hospital. We think that there were only about 4 people died on board ambulance trains in the UK, which is such a small number when you think that 2.7 million men travelled by ambulance train.
The refreshment stands at mainline stations were quite sort of indicative of the wider war effort, particularly in the beginning of the war, where there was a huge sort of groundswell of voluntary activity to help support troops. All of the main railway companies erected memorials at a lot of the main stations. They're still there today. They still act as a sort of a massive source of kind of public memorialisation, you know, obviously with poppies and wreaths left there on the 11th of November for Remembrance Sunday.
Many of the railway families, there will possibly be many generations of people working for the railways, and therefore there were lost several generations during the conflict.